After steadily destroying the facade of Hong Kong's legislative complex on Monday, protesters entered the building leaving broken glass and torn steel shutters in their wake, hours after the government held a ceremony commemorating the 22nd anniversary of the territorial's return to China from Britain. Come on, people of Hong Kong, dozens of demonstrators gathered along the side of the building shouted. Using metals bars and makeshift battering rams to break the building's outside glass walls and doors, some protesters entered the building and attempted to force open metal roller shutters that sealed the entrance to the legislative chambers. The protesters did not seem to have a clear strategy beyond the destruction of the building's facade. After shattering several glass walls and doors, many did not enter the building but instead moved on to rip off metal panels and steel strips. Riot police with gas masks and shields guarded the facility from within the building, holding up signs warning the protesters that they would use force if the demonstrators charged. The police and government said they condemned the violence at the legislature and said that officers were exercising restraint. The mayhem at the Legislative Council followed protests in the morning that saw thousands of demonstrators trying to march to the site of a government ceremony that was attended by the city's chief executive, Carrie Lamentations. Hundreds of riot police officers pushed them back by beating them with batons and dousing them with pepper spray. I think most of the Hong Kong people are in no mood to celebrate, Lam Cheuk Ting, a Democratic lawmaker who joined the protesters, said of the July 1st holiday. We urge Carrie Lam to step down as soon as possible, because she has refused to listen to the Hong Kong people for so long. Huge crowds of demonstrators have taken to Hong Kong's streets in the past several weeks, protesting a bill that would allow extraditions to mainland China. The protests forced Mrs. Lam to suspend the bill, but demonstrators want a full withdrawal and for her to resign. The turnout of protesters on Monday was among the largest attempts to disrupt the Hong Kong government's most important annual political event. It underscored the deepening anxiety that many in Hong Kong, which under the handover agreement is to maintain a high degree of autonomy from the mainland until 2047, feel about the erosion of the civil liberties that set the city apart. Monday's protests, falling on the 98th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, were a direct challenge to President Xi Jinping and his increasingly authoritarian policies. Analysts said the chaos risked giving Mr. Xi an opportunity to justify his tough approach. If it gets really violent, the risk is that Beijing has a good excuse to become even more uncompromising, said Jean-Pierre Cabestan, a political scientist at Hong Kong Baptist University. Xi can put even more pressure on Carrie Lam not to make any concessions. Protesters who joined the demonstration outside the legislature said they were frustrated that the government was not listening to their concerns. Friends, Donna T. Leave, read the signs many were waving. People of Hong Kong, Donna T. Give up, This was the latest instance in which a group of predominantly younger protesters have taken measures that test the boundaries of civil disobedience in this usually orderly financial hub. In recent weeks, to protest the extradition bill and what they saw as a heavy-handed police response, the protesters have twice besieged the city's police headquarters and sought to disrupt government services. The protesters, who are predominantly young people and students, said they chose to descend on the Legislative Council because the police prevented them from getting close to the site of the government's flag-raising ceremony that morning. Several protesters said that while they did not personally plan to break into the complex, they supported those on the front lines who did. Peaceful protest methods were ineffective, they said, and they increasingly felt open to a more confrontational approach if it would help to protect Hong Kong's freedom and relative independence from Beijing. Not all protesters supported the handful who attacked the Legislative Council in the early afternoon. Several Democratic lawmakers tried to stop the protesters by positioning themselves between the demonstrators and the building but were eventually pushed aside. Claudia Mo, who was among the pro-democracy legislators attempting to stop the protesters, said she thought the violence had affected the turnout of the peaceful march. I am extremely worried because the young really seem like they have nothing to lose, when they have a lot to lose, Ms. Mo said. Ida s their Hong Kong they are fighting for. Ida s their future and they need to take their future into account. Sampson Yuen, a political scientist at Lingnan University in Hong Kong who studies social movements and identity politics, said that many protesters who felt like they were facing repression could set aside their ideological differences about the use of violence. People understand that they need to band together in order to avoid being fragmented. In the morning, police used batons and pepper spray to beat and push back demonstrators who tried to march to the convention center. Protesters who had been hit with pepper spray stumbled to seek help at medical stations set up by supporters. Some poured water over their bodies. The government said around midday that demonstrators had attacked police lines and thrown an unidentified liquid at officers. Some officers reported difficulties breathing and irritated skin, and 13 were sent to the hospital, the government said in a statement. The police also said that some protesters had scattered lime powder at the police, injuring officers. Police strongly condemn such illegal acts and will stringently follow up, it said. Mrs. Lam, the CITIA's chief executive, sought to strike a conciliatory note on Monday morning, pledging that she and her government would be more responsive to public sentiment. She was earlier criticized for insisting on pushing the unpopular legislation through despite an intense public outcry. I will learn the lesson and ensure that the government's future work will be closer and more responsive to the aspirations, sentiments, and opinions of the community, Mrs. Lam said at the official ceremony commemorating the handover anniversary. The first and most basic step to take is to change the government's style of governance to make it more open and accommodating. Local television news channels broadcast a startling split screen. On one side, Mrs. Lam and officials from Hong Kong and mainland China clinked champagne flutes in a toast to a unification, on the other riot police clashed violently with protesters. Mrs. Lam said she would make more time to meet with people from different political backgrounds and reach out to the CITIA's youth. She said that Hong Kong's economy could feel the repercussions of a protracted trade war between the United States and China and urged Hong Kong residents to work with the government on managing the impact of the trade dispute and addressing the housing shortage and other issues. The broad public anger has already forced Mrs. Lam to suspend the proposed legislation, but demonstrators want it to be fully withdrawn and have also turned their scrutiny on the police, whom they say acted with excessive force in dispersing a June 12 protest. A march was planned for later in the day that pro-democracy organizers said was expected to draw a large turnout. Separately, tens of thousands of other protesters, including families and children, braved nearly 90-degree heat on Monday afternoon to fill the streets of downtown Hong Kong in a separate demonstration calling on the CITIA's leader to resign. Protesters carried signs saying "A free HK democracy now, and a Hong Kong fights for democracy." The march began at Victoria Park, where a few people handed out yellow signs urging people to stand firm and investigate police violence. Carrie Lam, step down, get some dignity for yourself, said Lo Woon Fun, 84, who was sitting under a small umbrella in the muddy field at the beginning of the march. I came out today because I want to tell Carrie Lam that despite my old age I still come out to demand she step down. I have come here because of the future generation of ours. I want them to live a good life as I have, she said. Members of the Labor Union for Postal Service Workers carried a large printed banner that read, "When a million people walk against the mainstream, it's inhumane to neglect it," referring to a massive protest in June. Alexandra Stevenson, Mike Ives, Tiffany May, Catherine Lee, Javier Hernandez, Austin Ramsey, Jillian Wong and Ezra Chung contributed reporting.